Jimmy Glitch, Lorraine, for opening us in such a beautiful way as usual, and really grateful for you grounding us within this space. So what I propose to do, Nikita, do you want to introduce yourself, and then I'll maybe just give the more details on the agenda, our first mentee, and then turn to you. So, Nick.
For sure. Good afternoon, folks. My name's Nikita Kapeswad. I am Nahia from Moosomin First Nation. I work with the environment team. I have a background in environmental science and been with the AFN for past 2 years and helped on the organizing committee of the climate gathering. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, Nick, and you'll hear more from Nick. So what I'm going to put up on the screen currently is just our current plan for the 2 hours that we have together, and what we're trying to do with this space. So as you can likely see, we'll provide an overview of the climate gathering, what it was, what we brought out of it as the key themes, and then dig into a session that Nick and I hosted on the First Nations Climate Action Toolkit, and then have a layer of interactivity with all of you to further bring that along, recognizing that we want to make that a thoughtful and collaborative process. And then we'll return to Elder Lorraine for some closing prayers and remarks based on the discussion that we had. As you can see, we're going to try to use Menti, and we're going to try to do it in a way that's integrated into our PowerPoint. So on the screen here, there's a link. It's menti.com, and then there's a number 781-17989. So that's again 7811-7989, and you can join this specific session, and when you've joined, hopefully you can submit a response just where you're joining the webinar from, and then we'll start to see where everybody is joining from. We'll give that a minute or two for folks to respond. If the Menti is tricky, just let us know, and we can hear from the chat as well. And just in the chat, you'll see the menti.com, and there we go. And we're starting now to see where folks are joining from. Edmonton, Kenora, Newfoundland, Chilliwack. Oops. Where else do we see? I'll try to move down. Lequoimen, the boardroom at AFN. Grateful for our AFN team, Kenora, and many others. So grateful for all of you, and through the course of the session, we'll be able to look at those specific responses from folks as well. And we see about 25. So we might have a few more people who are just getting used to it, and as we see those responses, we'll be able to yeah, and we will capture all of this and share it with you so that you can see just the types of information that was provided. So maybe with that, and it seems like it's working, I'll turn it over to you, Nick, just to walk us a little bit through the planning for the National Climate Gathering.
For sure. Thanks, Graham. And before we get into the climate gathering, I just want to give some background information as to the work that we're doing at AFN, our mandates, and as well as our planning process. So the mandates that have guided us in this work began in July of 2019. Chiefs across Canada declared a First Nation climate emergency. And from there, the mandate came for AFN to plan national climate gatherings every 2 years and to also develop a national climate strategy. And so in 2023, a new resolution was passed called Urgent and Transformative Climate Action. This endorses the AFN implementation of the climate strategy, as well as 7 priority areas. And so in the to be it resolves, it urges all levels of government to work directly with First Nations, with right holders, with title holders to implement self-determined First Nation climate priorities. So that's a little bit about the background of our mandates. And we can go to the next slide. So the strategy was published October 2023, and the structure is that we have our guiding vision led by our elder statement. We have our introduction and objectives. We dive deep into what the First Nation climate leadership and climate lens looks like and how it can be applied. And then the rest of the report dives into the 7 priority areas that were identified from our discussions. And lastly, it goes to a conclusion. Next slide. So here's a timeline of where we have come from and where we plan to go. Again, starting in 2019, those 2 mandates. We've had the first gathering in 2020, and that was hosted in Whitehorse. Second gathering was held in Fredericton in 2022. And altogether, about 1,000 folks have gathered to talk about what the First Nation climate lens could look like, how we can implement this in the work we're doing. And so the goal for the 3rd National Climate Gathering was to, oh, you can see on that side, Graham, is to have a bigger climate gathering. Okay, where are we? Guiding vision. So diving into the foundation of the work that we're doing, in 2016, a group of over 100 elders from all across Canada came together in Fort St. John. And this was in partnership with AFN's Elders Council, and they released a statement on environment and climate change, really acknowledging the climate crisis, as well as calling for rapid action to meet the target of the Paris Agreement. So this is an important foundation in our work that we're doing at AFN and the work that we're doing with the National Climate Gatherings. And so we just wanted to highlight that this is what guides our work. Next slide. So from those 2 previous gatherings, developed a First Nation climate lens. So in the work that we're doing, we really wanted to bring into focus the relationships, how unique and complex they are between First Nations and climate impacts, as well as climate action and the broader climate landscape. So it really emphasizes the role of First Nation as climate leaders and active drivers of transformative change. And just to give a brief overview, we have Circle 1 at the center. It's a heart natural law. This is the set of laws that originate directly from Creator, and it's really our original instructions on how we must interact with the land as First Nations people. Moving out to Circle 2, we have actions, and this highlights our First Nations worldview, which is really the core of our understanding how we are with the land and our sacred responsibility that continues to guide how we protect and respect Mother Earth. Third circle is the lived reality, the impacts of colonization, the legacy and how that has extracted from the land and forcibly removed us from the land and our practices, and dives into addressing the climate crisis, how it cannot be separate from the broader project of First Nations self-determination and reconciliation. Lastly, we move out to the outer circle, which is context. This is the legal and policy ecosystem that we are all currently living in, working in, and navigating. And so all of this climate action really operates within the First Nation and colonial context, including the federal's adoption of the UN Declaration Act. And so combine these 4 lenses, bring into focus what First Nation climate solutions can look like, how we can use this in our work going forward. And our team is currently developing a toolkit based off this lens. And so we could go to the next slide. So I was mentioning in the climate strategy, there were 7 priority areas that were identified. Each priority area has a goal, has a set of objectives, as well as a list of specific actions and strategies. These are not intended to be a comprehensive review of all First Nation priorities, but rather, it's intended to be an enabling document. It's intended to create space for First Nations at the local and regional levels to advance their own climate strategies and priorities. Next slide. And so based off the work that has been going on with the climate strategy, with the First Nation climate lens, this has led us into the planning for what the third and biggest climate gathering can look like. And so we started planning this in September 2023. We had a great cross-sectional planning committee within the AFN. What's highlighted in the climate strategy is that climate change impacts all areas of the work that we're doing. And so we really wanted to reflect that in the planning in the organization. And so that was great work that was done within our team. We also launched a call for sessions in the spring, and we received over 100 applications, which was huge. And so we worked really hard to review and accept a majority of these sessions into the agenda. And I think we did a pretty good job into incorporating all of them. And I also wanted to highlight that we had a First Nations designer, Yoroma. She created the First Nation climate lens, as well as our logo that you see on the PowerPoint. And so we really wanted to ensure that the First Nation climate lens and the gathering were reflective of ceremony. We wanted this gathering to center those aspects. A part of our planning was also working with regional organizations to bring in the regional representation. We don't have a regional office in Alberta, so this made the work very interesting. And we worked with the Treaty 7 Chiefs Council to ensure that we are incorporating local First Nations and leaders and youth on the ground. And I think we did a good job in reflecting that. We also collaborated with the AFN health sector on accessibility and disability inclusion. This is one of the key highlights in the work that we're doing when we're developing a toolkit, wanting to ensure that it is centered in accessibility, so none of us are left behind. Lastly, we did a call out for local Indigenous artists and musicians in the area, and we had some good response, and we could talk about that a little later on. Next slide, please. So just some really high level highlights. So we had over 1,000 participants from every province and territory except Nunavut, which is huge. This is our biggest gathering yet. So that was really the goal, was to bring this many people in. We had great opening remarks from Elder Clarence Wolflag, Elder Charlie Crowchild, and David McGinnis. We also had a drum group from Stoney Nakoda, Hey Ya Hey, open us up in a good way and lead our ceremonies. We had 5 plenary panels ranging from youth to women in climate and transformative action. We had 50 concurrent sessions, and again, really wanted to highlight how climate is related to all of the work that we're doing. So there's a vast majority on AI, on accessibility, on water security, on clean energy, where we also wanted to highlight local work that's going on the ground. And so Sutina gave a really great presentation on the Buffalo project that they have going on in their land. But Gunny First Nation also started bringing in aquaponds to their to their schools, as well as starting their own bioculture species preservation. And so we were able to work with local First Nations on that. Some other highlights on the next page is that we had a really great and robust trade show, over 34 vendors, different First Nation artists coming in. Our opening reception on Monday, we had a youth drum group, Baby Flats. So they're from Treaty 7, Baby Flats and dancers. And that was a very refreshing and inspiring way to open up the gathering is by letting our youth lead. So we're very happy about that. On the Wednesday night, we had an entertainment night. Two Cree artists from Edmonton area came in and performed. Creation and Connie, sorry, I can't remember her last name. Connie Lagarde, I think is her, how you pronounce it. But really great artists. And so really just wanted to center First Nation artists, different work that's going on, different ways that all of these connect to climate as well. Next slide, please. And so kicking off our climate gathering, we started with a youth day. We wanted to ensure that the youth were prepared going into the gathering. And so on the 7th, we had, again, the drum group Baby Flats and dancers come in and start us off in a good way with good ceremony and prayer. We had an opening prayer by Elder Charlie Crowchild and some opening remarks from the National Youth Council co-chairs and portfolio holders. They really set the context as to how important it is that our voices are at these high-level discussions. And so we facilitated breakout discussions for the youth as to what they would like to see in the coming days, as well as how they wanted to be involved. And so we spent the rest of the day giving space to you, telling us what they would like to see, how they would like to be heard. And then we ended it off with a networking event with climate change professionals to provide mentorship if that was the route they would like to take. And from this youth day, there was a lot of interest in the development of a national youth council, climate change council. And so our team is currently looking into what that could be and how we can keep the momentum going from this youth day. Some key themes, again, highlighting youth. We really wanted to ensure that the transfer of knowledge was there for our youth. And so from the Youth Day, our National Youth Council actually held a panel and reflected back to First Nation leaders, to technicians as to how they can mentor youth, how could they bring us in a circle. And so really just wanted to uplift the role of our youth in climate leadership. Another key theme was conservation. Being in the prairies, wanted to connect those pieces of terrestrial and marine leadership of First Nations, of all the different work that's going on across the country. Another area is to move into the implementation of the climate strategy. So we spent the past two gatherings discussing what it could look like. Now we wanted to develop a toolkit as to how we can bring this into the work that we're doing. And lastly, the act of gathering as climate action itself. This country is so huge. We have so many different things going on. We wanted to provide a space for us to just come together and gather and discuss what First Nation solutions can look like in climate. And so now moving into next steps, our team is currently working on a gathering report. We're also working on a report on the youth gathering. So those will be two separate reports, but interconnected. We're also working on a video project. We've had video projects on the past two gathering. We're working on that currently. We're also open into like how we can use these video projects to educate or in other different areas. So we're open to any of ideas of that sort. And lastly, we're planning our fourth gathering in 2026. We don't know where, but we are starting to think in that direction. So if you would love to host us in your region, we are all ears. And with that, I'll hand it off to Graham to dive into the toolkit. Thanks.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Nick. Really, really insightful and tough to capture the depth and breadth of enormous gathering. And so very grateful for your presentation, Nick, but also all those who participated. Um, we wanted just to, if there are folks who actually attended, we wanted to hear and provide an opportunity for some of you to share your reflections. So if you want to jump back on that Mentimeter, so it's menti.com. The code is 7817989. And we'd love to hear, you know, were there any key takeaways? We like the 10 out of 10 as well. But any additional just messages or teachings or reflections that you may have carried back into your own work on the basis of that climate gathering. We'll give it a bit of time. See if there's any others that pop up. Great. Yeah, we have an audience for our next one, which is excellent. Relationships and the centrality of those, hearing from youth and elders, climate action and ceremony. Yeah, not being able to attend all the different sessions. Merci, Jeremy. Yeah, and just we know that 50 is a lot, and so we are also keen to try to figure out how to balance just the amount of interest that First Nations have expressed with also just the reality of wanting to attend multiple ones and participate. Keep uplifting our youth. Really, really great. We'll maybe give it another minute or so. We also, just because we're a little bit less than what we had expected of participants, and so also just want to invite anybody to put their hand up if you want to share verbally. This is the point at which we're going to go into our next presentation that Nick shared, just on the climate action toolkit. That was a session that we presented. Very helpful for those who just said that they weren't aware of it. That means that we can do a little bit of a better job advertising and ensuring that folks not only can participate but also hear the types of conversations um, that that emerged in that space. What else? We have a clear commitment from First Nations on further leadership. And learning just while working with First Nations a new way to think and be and work on these issues. Joe, you wanted to share? I see your hand up.
Yes, I was just going to say that I really enjoyed the whole gathering as a whole, but uh, I kind of liked how we could go to specific sessions. Um, I just found it was a lot easier to be engaged when you were able to like kind of pick what topic you're really interested in or whatever. So
Great.
yeah, I really enjoyed that, and I enjoyed the lunches, just sitting with different people, like sitting with different people and listening to all their stories, and yeah, it was just really interesting. I enjoyed the entire session, and I thought it was extremely well organized, to be honest with you, very well organized, and it was really insightful, and I enjoyed it a lot. So yeah, that's it.
Oh, that's awesome. Thanks for sharing that, Joe. And Yeah, definitely the room for lunch seemed to be a very popular space, and not just because of the food. So really great. Okay, maybe let's stop there. There are a lot of responses, and luckily I can see them on this screen. Some folks just talked about just the extensiveness of the topics that were covered, looking for a more active role, and especially just being as an ally to this work, and how to work with First Nations across the country. So if there's anything else, we'll leave that slide up, and you can continue to share and continue to, just follow the work that we do as we plan for our next gathering. As Nick shared, we haven't really determined the location yet, but we've hosted one on the East Coast, we've hosted one in the North, we've hosted one in the Prairies, and so there's kind of Central and Western Canada that is a little bit open at this point, and so invite our relatives from those areas in particular. Um, so for the next, 90 minutes of our conversation, we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about one of the key action areas within the National Climate Strategy. There are 107 strategies and actions within the climate strategy, and one of them is focused on essentially creating a National First Nations Climate Action Toolkit. And we really started that process in earnest at the National Climate Gathering itself, where we hosted a dedicated workshop on the topic. And really that dedicated workshop was just exploratory in nature. Like, how are we broadly thinking about this in order to learn and engage with all of the existing toolkits and work that First Nations across the country have already done, and really from a desire of not wanting to replicate that, but wanting to add and support that. And so here you see, this was one of the 50 sessions. It's tough to draw, a good number of people in an 800 person gathering, but as you can see, we had a good session that was quite interactive, and folks contributed actively to the space that we created and to the broad ideas that were shared in there. And really what we're doing in this presentation is to reflect some of that, and then to take that next step forward together. Um, and so what we presented at the climate gathering session was a bit of an overview presentation. So we provided a very short overview of existing toolkits that we were aware of in a wide variety of different areas. And so there are several toolkits that First Nations have developed, or First Nation related organizations have developed on adaptation. There are other ones on monitoring, including community-based monitoring and just how to set up a community-based monitoring program. There are those that are focused on supporting clean energy and the development of clean energy, and then also really specific, more nuanced ones about specific disciplines. So whether that's about infrastructure and the development of climate safe infrastructure, or how First Nations can participate within an emerging carbon offset market, which BCAFN had prepared. And so really wanted to map out that in order to understand, where we could see ourselves, and not replicating, but adding value, and maybe even bringing all of those together in conversation with one another. We had a specific focus, and that really aligns with the values of the gathering that were both in the preparatory and implementation phase, which include the perspectives of our young people, women, persons with disability, gender diverse folks, as essential components of the work that we were aspiring to do. And then basically had a real thoughtful breakout based discussion on three key areas: themes, scope, and audience. And in each of those, the presentation here is about just, what we heard from that, what we summarized, and then what we can contemplate on the next iteration of that. Um, I just had a comment in the chat about the specific toolkits that were reviewed. We can share that with folks. It was in the presentation that we had delivered at the climate gathering, and can make sure that's accessible for folks. I anticipate there are many others, and so for those who know different ones within your networks, like, would love for you to share those with us so that we can map out really where all of those fit. And so here, just going to provide like a high level overview of the discussions that we had. So we presented some broad objectives that we had thought would be relevant, and then spoke with those in the room about their resonance and other considerations. So, how do we uplift the reciprocal relationship that First Nations have with the lands and waters, in order to communicate something actionable, the action-oriented nature of climate action? Can we provide frameworks, resources, data sources, and even just mapping out partners to empower First Nations to develop their own climate strategies, ensuring the ethical and equitable engagement of our knowledge systems, especially as it relates to climate science. Weave those lenses of gender, accessibility, and youth, and then, of course, highlight case stories of First Nations leadership on the ground. And so we heard a lot of resonance with that, but also really focused pieces like making sure that we have support technicians or support representatives to actually enable First Nations or support First Nations in applying the toolkit in their specific contexts. How do we ensure that there are active feedback loop mechanisms so that we can continue to iterate and improve on the document in order for it to serve the support, or serve First Nations who are using it, ensure that tools feel actionable and solutions oriented, create space to weave in impacts of climate and history on First Nations more broadly, center the land and water as sacred and essential beings, and really that's moving from the ego to the ecocentric framing, land-based education and a rights-based approach, incorporate flowcharts and templates for communities. And for instance, there's a research group at Laurentian called Up North that have done a lot of work on adaptation planning, that have really useful flowcharts and templates that First Nations could use, and potentially we could connect in this overarching context. How do we center health and well-being and reflect accessible and First Nation centric language? And part of that is making that ensure that terms are accessible and defined. On the scope and audience, we basically spoke a little bit about AFN as a national organization, and wanting it to be complementary but national in scope, action oriented, grounded in our leadership and knowledge systems, weaving an element of policy and analysis and advocacy. And then we spoke a little bit about audience and how do we emphasize the different roles that exist within our communities, whether that's technicians, community members, or leadership who are interested in the process of developing climate strategies. And we heard a lot of really thoughtful reflections on this, including aspects around policy, implementation and education, access to baseline studies and case stories, different levels of jurisdiction, whether First Nations, federal, provincial, territorial, or municipal, ensuring that it's an evergreen document and that we can continue to update and support, just improvements over time, creating ways to identify partners in different areas, really embodying the required need to shift the paradigm to create space for First Nations worldviews and perspectives, addressing the root causes that Nikita described in our First Nations climate lens, which is really those systems of imbalance as that root cause, and addressing those human values that derive from that, transforming climate action through language, ceremony, and wise practices. And we tried to do that within our climate gathering. How can we do it within this document? Considering those knowledge gaps, considering the other toolkits that exist, and maybe just different audiences. So for the community, how do we develop and support a toolkit? For leadership, how do we add those elements of policy and governance that may be beneficial to enact that? Include a section on lessons learned, explicit about how to include elders and knowledge holders, representing just different capacities and readiness, and then offering additional toolkit training and capacity support. And just to be clear, like when we frame this as national in scope, like it's really not to take space away from First Nations rights and title holders and the essential role that they play. It's how does AFN as an organization serve First Nations in the development of their own climate strategies and really just create, enabling factors as Nikita described in the priority areas to support nations in doing that in an appropriate way to their context. And then finally, when we talked a little bit about like what are the key elements, and I think you can probably see there is a little bit of interaction around all of these different pieces, and so was really helpful to try to ensure that, or just hear that and then see those interconnectivities. So key elements: how do we ground this in spirituality, ceremony, and legal orders, guided by knowledge keepers? Framing of rights and responsibilities, both sides of the coin, center First Nation knowledge systems to really articulate a First Nations understanding of climate solutions, making it not a one-size-fits-all approach, but really just enabling for those place-based, actionable, concrete resources, and then frameworks of monitoring and evaluation. And in addition to those reflections, how do we consider treaties, land claims, land codes? How do we actually support the shifting of the underlying economy towards one that is restorative, adaptive, reciprocal? We heard the monitoring and evaluation was important, and I'll show you just what we're thinking on this basis. How do we ensure accessibility is a key element of this? Toolkits for kids, parents, youth leaders, and we definitely recognize the importance of our young people, and we'll show just broadly what we're thinking. How do we also just understand the specific risks that First Nations are facing, and even how we conceptualize and think about risk, and then direct links to data sources. And so, that was broadly a high level summary of a 2-hour dialogue. But we have all the notes, we have the stickies from what people have contributed, and really it's how do we take that and how do we continue to move that forward. But before we jump into what we're thinking and how to move this forward, wanted just to create space, and some people have already done so, just in the chat, like anything that we shared resonated with you, anything to add, the kind of opportunity for popcorn contributions before we get into what we're thinking on that basis. And so again, this is on our menti.com, and it's 781-7989. And if anybody wants to put their hand up and share verbally, happy to do that as well. So we'll give a couple minutes for folks to respond to that. Yeah, Christopher.
Hi, thanks. Well, Christopher Peters, yeah, I just wanted to make a comment. I've been working in the climate world for a little over a year now. And one of the issues that's come up is working with government, whether it be federal, provincial, regional, or municipal. And so, for example, I'll give you one topic. And so I'm coming from British Columbia, so-called British Columbia. And there's a lot of climate work going on within the provincial government in regards to disaster and climate risk and resilience assessment. And they're in let's say, a 5-year work plan through that. And we're at the stage where regional scale assessments will begin. And some of the meetings I've attended were to provide First Nations feedback. And they wanted to, so they've invited a number of communities and organizations to attend and provide feedback with a First Nations lens. However, a lot of the staff that are working for these organizations are not First Nations, and they do not represent First Nations other than their job, but they felt that they were being highlighted and being used by the government to state that they had qualified the government for First Nations engagement. And so the few people that I had a chance to talk to have actually stood up and waved their hands and said, yes, we do work for First Nations community or organization, but we do not represent the viewpoints of them. And you cannot say that because I came to your meeting that you can cross off your list that you did have meaningful First Nations engagement. So that's something that I'd like to know a little bit about from AFN on how because you did talk about government relationships, I guess, a little earlier. Is there any kind of ideas on how we go about that? Because all across the country, there's a lot of climate work being done, and there's a possibility that it could be done better when including AFN or BCFN in my region or other organizations involved in the climate world. Thanks.
Yeah, really helpful, Christopher, and definitely something that we've come across regularly on not only how do we support First Nations and participating meaningfully in whether it's provincial or federal processes, but also how we make sure that those mechanisms of consent are protected and upheld. And so yes, we have some resources on that specifically. Years ago, there's a group that is called the Joint Committee on Climate Action. It has First Nation regional representatives and federal department, or First Nations regional advocates is how they frame it. And in 2020, we worked on a document called the Best Practices Guide for meaningful relationships with First Nations. And a lot of what you described speak to some of those that were laid out. And maybe what we'll do, we'll follow up from this email or from this webinar and share some of those, but then also consider how that's represented within the toolkit. How do nations express the appropriate process that partners need to engage in, or layers of colonial government, and yeah, can try to do that. So there are a bunch of different really thoughtful contributions on the screen, how to be explicit about youth and youth inclusions, how to consider those holistic perspectives and connect all the different elements, accessible language, absolutely. Like, we don't want this just to be another bureaucratic exercise that doesn't speak to the reality of nations and communities on the ground. How do we center natural law as a foundational piece? And in the First Nations climate lens that Nick had presented, that is really that first concentric circle. How are we reconnecting with those original instructions, and how do we envision and understand a climate strategy on that basis? How do we make sure that material is adapted to the challenges and experiences of communities, and really put First Nations in the driver's seat and communicate on that basis? How do we also just think about self and community care? I really like just wellness and healing justice as a broad framing, show the interconnected issues. And if you haven't already, broadly engaged with our work, one of the central tenets to our climate work is that, climate lens is not the problem in itself. It's a lens through which you can look at all these root causes. And so as we see, just that interconnectedness, it's really, really important. So really, really helpful. And then there are some, just practical pieces that folks have shared of other assets or toolkits that even, non-Indigenous organizations have prepared, but may be helpful in just the work that we're doing. I would try to put some of those on the screen, but I don't know exactly how to move the comments down. But rest assured that I see it on the actual Menti and am speaking to some of them. So what we wanted to do now, and we have a good amount of time to do that, is actually take that next step forward on what to do with the climate action toolkit and how to think about, on the basis of that initial conversation that we had, on the basis of these contributions, what it could look like. And with you workshopping some of these elements to breathe life into that. So, we've now actually turned our mind into like what the goal, objectives, and outline could be, and want to present that and speak with all of you on it. And then the plan is also to have more focus sessions through the course of the summer, the spring and summer, to make sure that this is usable and supportive of folks, and really envisioning it as a way in which that we can connect the web of toolkits and other resources for nations to develop their own climate strategies and solutions. And so if it wasn't explicit, that really is the broad strategy and the goal of our climate action toolkit is supporting nations within their own appropriate processes to develop their own climate strategies and solutions. And we've seen, different examples of that across the country. Christopher mentioned BCAFN. We know that BCAFN has worked with other the First Nations Leadership Council to develop the BC First Nations Climate Action and Emergency Plan. We've seen in the Yukon the Reconnection Vision. And so there are, these, and then there are more community-based. Grand Council Treaty 3 has done one and is working actively on that. And so there are a lot of different examples that, our intention is really not to replicate any of that. It's really just to say, how do we bring these into conversation and connect that with folks so that they can develop it in a way that's appropriate for them. So broadly on that basis, we would have an introductory chapter or section that introduces some of the guiding principles that we had spoken about earlier, just about centering First Nations knowledge systems, centering the natural law, centering just the different recommendations that were shared, talking a little bit about the broad objectives of what this toolkit is, what it isn't as well. We're not trying to introduce anything that is prescriptive. We're trying very actively to just be enabling for nations to develop themselves. What are some key sources of information that you can draw upon and engage with? And then what are any additional resources or toolkits that really map out all of those interconnections, and really how do we create that in a way that's accessible? And to Christopher's earlier point, even the best practices document and the documents that have been worked on with the feds on ensuring respectful relationships between Crown governments, colonial governments, and First Nations, and how to support that actively. And so basically on that basis, we have our first section that we described as that opening, and then really the second and the meat of the toolkit itself will be this section 2, focused broadly on 4 things. So first, how do we build a foundation? How do we essentially understand where our community, our nation is at with respect to understanding climate change, both just from the impacts to the land, but also just the scientific basis as well. On the basis of building that foundation, how do we then design a strategy that is appropriate for our specific context, grounded in the specific community protocols, centering youth, centering our elders and our knowledge keepers, supporting our leadership and communities to participate. How do we act, and what are the ways in which that we can make that action oriented a way to connect to these different resources, whether that's funding, whether that's additional technical expertise, whether that's anything that a community really requires. And then how do we embed monitoring and evaluation grounded in First Nations understandings on how to continue to improve iteratively within the work that is being done. And so really those are really high level, but we saw those as, you know, those key pieces that a nation or a community could walk through to develop, implement, and then reflect on the climate strategy themselves. And so in these, so this will just provide a little bit of broad framing. And you know, we have again less people, and so I think we'll spend a bit more time on just hearing your ideas, hearing your reflections. As Christopher shared, like, we would invite you to put your hand up and to contribute. We had a lot more people registered, and so we adapted our approach a little bit differently because of that, but want to make this as interactive as possible. So in our first stage, in our stage of building the foundation, how do we create space to understand climate change, climate risks both from, you know, a Western science perspective, but also from a First Nations perspective, understand the impacts, the cumulative and compounding nature of those impacts. How do we connect ourselves to research and information? And I saw a couple folks who participate in, you know, different settings, including universities. How do we build relationship with universities to help create essentially information that nations can access to build that understanding? How do we also support and learn from effective programs to empower community climate champions? For instance, the Catalyst 2020 program that Indigenous Clean Energy runs. How do we imagine something similar in the context of preparing a climate strategy and implementing that, which is a longstanding conversation that we've been having with our regional climate change coordinators, but also the Chiefs Committee that informs a lot of the work that we at AFN do, the Advisory Committee on Climate Action and the Environment. And so resources that, you know, came up that are accessible, things like the Climate Atlas. The Climate Atlas, climateatlas.ca, is a document that supports visualization of climate impacts. And years ago, we had worked with them to add specific information on First Nation communities in particular. And so there's a layer that you can see the projected impacts on your nation depending on the different projected climate temperature increases and the implications of that. Climatedata.ca is very similar, but also just a little bit less user friendly. And so there are these different pieces that you know, communities could use to build this foundation and understanding. And also, of course, it's important to indicate when we say build the foundation, it's not that there's any question in understanding that communities know their land and the impacts best. It's how to just access these other resources to support that knowledge and experience, and then provide different toolkit examples, learning from section 1, but also applying those into this. The second broader stage is really designing the climate strategy itself. And so what's an appropriate community engagement process? How do we center, again, knowledge keepers, elders, young people, women, folks with disabilities, gender diverse individuals, and on the basis of that process, how do we develop a framework? And for instance, in the context of our national climate strategy, the broad conceptual framework was the presentation that Nick shared about our climate lens, the First Nations climate lens, which was a way in which that we, you know, essentially recentered the conversation on the lessons of climate change that we were hearing from nations across the country in the 4 years of development of that climate strategy in order to challenge that really dominant narrative of, what climate change is and what it's about. How do we ensure that framework is, and how do we support nations in connecting that into the important work that they're already doing on emergency management, that we know, and in the climate strategy, it's not only about emergencies of weather or other extreme impacts, but all of the other interconnected crises that our communities continue to face. What are different ways of monitoring and evaluation? What are the different roles and interactions with other governments, other layers of government, and how to support that? So, what are the resources and how can we support in the identification of community resources, technical or other supports, existing toolkits and outlines and documents that can be used, roles and responsibilities of municipalities, provinces, territories, federal governments, other emergency management plans. And so how do we build that and support that as a piece in the moving to action? And you may see that these are relatively simple, largely because we want to have this discussion with you. So after we have the climate plan, how do we move it into action? And for instance, we're working on that implementation plan with our national climate strategy. How do we breathe life into 107 strategies and actions that were outlined? And so how do we support the development of that implementation plan, including how that can be connected to funding sources, technical expertise, regional centers of networks, other existing work, et cetera, and how to support the implementation. And then really getting to monitoring and evaluating, testing, reviewing, updating as necessary, and how to connect that with processes or organizations thinking about that work, like, for instance, First Nations Information and Governance Center, and other organizations that are doing just different work on that. So that's actually the kind of final piece that we wanted to present. And so what I would propose is, maybe we can just invite you to share any thoughts that you might have in a written format. And then I think what I'd actually recommend is that I'll stop sharing this screen, and we can just have a discussion with those on the webinar, and really hearing all the expertise that folks have in these areas, and just wanting to create that space. We have a bit more time than we had expected, and so want to hear from all of you. So the questions on the screen and the questions more broadly is, what'd you like? What's missing on the basis of those pieces? How can it be improved? What are other areas of consideration that you have experience and expertise with that you would recommend we look at and engage in? As mentioned, we'll have another conversation a little bit later on the broad engagement plan that we're thinking, and how all of you can participate. But yeah, kind of opening that up for folks. Yeah, great point. How to share, how to build that, like, just that peer-to-peer learning, and the best that we've come up with so far is these climate gatherings. But how do we capture that? How do we ensure that more access is a part of that? Really helpful. Yeah, emergency management, wildfire and flood resilient actions, great. How do we create that collaborative approach? How do we map out other organizations that maybe aren't only working on climate change, but are working on other things that are related to climate change when you think about it from that structural lens? And also, if folks just want to put their hand up, and share any reflections or experiences that you have. I just saw, and Johan, you're probably well placed about GCT3 and the work that they're doing in the development of their own toolkits, and yeah, what are the synergies? We know that the First Nations Leadership Council in BC is working on one as well. And so again, like, our approach here is not to replicate something that's unnecessary. It's really how do we think thoughtfully about the role that we can bring and contribute to this space. And really the way in which we do that is through conversation with all of you on the line and with many others who signed up and may wanted to participate. Intersectional collaboration, mapping those assets, great. I had a comment in the chat just about climate risk assessments need to consider vulnerability, which is complex and not only socioeconomic, and First Nations natural law considers this. And so how do you add that column to the risk registry and to account appropriately for that? So that's really, really helpful. Yeah, what are the ways in which, just First Nations understandings can influence consumption and broader paradigms of climate action? Really helpful. Connect with university researchers, reputable community researchers who can work in this space, and just connect to faculty and other centers of expertise. Vulnerability assessments, strategic planning, asset management, all different pieces, and doing all of that from a First Nations perspective. Oops. Give folks a bit more time, and then we'll open it up and invite folks to put your hand up. If you do just want to put your hand up and contribute orally, feel free to do so as well. Would love to hear from all of you. Okay, a specific link for health research networks. That's great. Really helpful. Tips on implementation and keeping up momentum and support. Absolutely. Right. Oops, again, my bad. Okay, you know what I'm gonna do? I'm just gonna stop sharing for now and just kind of open it up in case anybody wants to contribute. Any hands go up to share your experiences or things as you're thinking about the work that you're doing that you may want to share with us, or recommendations. We're down to hear it all. Michelle Edwards, please.
Good morning. Yeah, thanks for asking. I was looking at the foundation part of it, and when you talk about having community champions, we also need to look at nation champions as well, because the geography changes at the nation level, and that's why we have so many distinct languages, especially in the province of BC. Also, the sharing part of it, I think, is crucial because the wildlife and the landscape goes through all of our nations. They don't recognize these borders that have been created by industry and other governments. And the climate changes every day, right? It's always changed. And so how do we actually get ready for that and make it so it's a lot easier for the next generation to be able to just I guess benefit from it. Right now we will starve, and the land will starve until we start making the changes. I was on a climate action team appointed by the province a few years ago, and their only solution was planting trees. Well, realistically, the trees in our nation are going to take 200 years to grow. to be, as they want to see it economically feasible for them. So they just make really stupid decisions that don't benefit the land or the people. They benefit industry. And that's what we just need to keep reminding them, that that's what they do, right? It's not really anything that matters. But right now we need to see that if the land is starving, we're going to starve. And what are we going to do about that? And, can start with fish. That is the big provider along with rabbit. Right? So those are the things that if we don't see them on the land, it's starving. And that is going to mean that we are going to starve. And that's that's a whole mental exhaustion that, we're going to have to deal with. Right? That we're losing all these ways of life because the climate is changing. Can we adapt to it? Yes. But we have to do it together. We cannot do it individually. We cannot do it at a community level. It has to be at the nation level. Thank you.
Really, really insightful. Very much for that, Michelle. Anyone else want to share? Just as Michelle was sharing, there are other pieces that came into the Menti that are equally insightful. How do we consider just other organizations? And Michelle raised a point about just industry. How do we create space to interface with industry? And what are the other networks of organizations that work in that area? Yeah, how to think about just longer term funding and connecting those resources with governments or otherwise, but also contemplating a context of austerity, and how do we work within ourselves through those networks. How do we help lobby and support advocacy at the provincial level, and what are the ways to do that? How do we use our gatherings to enable people to work on their plans together? How do we facilitate that cross national coordination? Christopher, I see your hand up again. I'll go back to you.
Great, thank you. Yeah, good to hear from you, Michelle, again. One of the projects that I kind of started to get involved with was possibly Fraser River Center. And so in BC, the Fraser River has had some pretty big landslides. One was called the Big Bar landslide, where it actually blocked the river and the fish were no longer able to access their spawning tributaries and streams up the river. So there was a professor at SFU who had done a 3-year project. It just wrapped up like maybe 6 months ago. One of his suggestions was to build a Fraser River Center, which a lot of major rivers across the world have. In BC, we do not. And so he was talking to me about possibly finding a First Nations entity that could possibly either operate it or help fund it, or at the very least become monitors. So what the intent there was in the 3-year study they did on the Fraser River, they highlighted 12 locations where there was a very high probability and major devastation to the river highlighted. And so the idea would be a Fraser River Center could, one, provide baseline information for the river, because there is really no baseline information for the river as of 2025. And then also to provide a resource for another entity called Land Guardians, perhaps, where First Nations go out into the land and they could do the monitoring of those sites to ensure that when there is a possible landslide or if there is a blockage of the river, that it will be addressed immediately and not going to take like 6 months like this most recent one had occurred. So that's an example of some of the work that I've been involved in, and most recently working with other faculty at other universities on projects and studies that they are working on. And what I've found lately is that working with those universities and post-secondary institutions, it is starting to balance out and become more relevant to supporting First Nations. Whereas talking about the SFU professor, for example, He had done 30 years of research on the Fraser River. Not once in his 30 years did he work with a First Nation until this most recent project. And it just blew his mind. And so he was really gung-ho about getting me to help him connect with other First Nations along the Fraser River to share his information, and to help him work with that type of river studies and river science. So what I'm seeing is that a lot of faculty now are starting to be a little more aware and have some cultural sensitivity and actually care to involve First Nations in the research work that they're doing in studies, and be proactive and reach out to community to involve community. So I think we're starting to see a big increase in First Nations being involved with that in an ethical way, as opposed to in the past where it's typically been non-ethical. And so I'm really appreciative of that, and I just wanted to share that I'm glad that you also brought up Laurentian doing adaptation planning. So it's starting to happen everywhere, and there should be a way for AFN or the local BC AFN to start kind of developing a team that can help move that forward faster. Thank you.
That's really, really insightful. Thanks for sharing that, Christopher. And yeah, indeed, there are very good members of universities and very challenging. And so really, really helpful. And even just contemplating, what are the ways in which that we as a national organization can map some of that work across the country and different resources. And I know there are a couple academics on the line currently that work actively with nations, and so there are good ones, and how do we connect that in that way? I'll invite folks to continue putting your hand up. I have a couple people who have made comments to me in the chat, Carolyn or Heidi. I don't know if either of you want to speak to that. Yeah, Heather, go ahead if you want to speak from an academic perspective.
Sure. I felt a little bit of ears burning at the moment. Hi, everybody. Heather Castleton. I'm one of those academics at the University of Victoria. And I was dropping in the Menti thing that if anybody wants to access academic articles and they can't because of paywalls, reach out to a friendly academic because we have free access to those through our libraries. So I can drop my contact information in the somehow to the tech folks. But I also wanted to bring up organizations like the Office of the Chief Public Health Officer of Canada, who is very much writing these days about climate change and health. There's a lot of good resources, I think, out there on her annual reports starting in 2020. Where she's turning her attention, this is Teresa Tam, turning her attention to climate and health, resilient communities, that kind of thing. Another area to access would be the National Collaborating Centers for Public Health. So there's one specifically for Indigenous health that people might know about. It's based in Prince George. And they've put out some important reports that I thought I could just drop into the Menti with some links to those reports that would be useful to folks. And then in terms of finding, I'm the one who find reputable researchers. That's often word of mouth. But another way to do that is you can, if there's a university near you that you want to connect with, you can usually, in your Google search bar, just put research expertise, the name of the university, and it'll take you to the university's website. And you can put in keywords. I want to find somebody who does climate change and disaster response, or climate change projections, or things like that. And it'll link you to those people. And then you can sort of do your own sleuthing about, do these seem like good people to work with? Like, are they coming with a good heart and good mind in this work and not extractive, which is often has been the case and still is in many, many ways. So, and I guess the other thing I wanted to bring up too was just about creating a community of practice of sorts, that it involves cross-sectoral engagement. I've heard a lot of that today about emergency management, climate science, public health, but people who can come together and need like a platform for that. It also needs sustainability in terms of somebody, a staff person, to be able to continue to bring people together electronically or in person. And of course, there's funding for that, but it's an opportunity to share stories about the most promising practices. So, in terms of how to be more prepared for the things that are going to be happening from not just a human health perspective, but from like an all our relations kind of perspective. Those were kind of the thoughts I wanted to share. Thanks, Graham.
That's awesome. Thanks, Heather, and really grateful for those reflections. And yeah, just ways to connect to some of those expertise. Are there any other reflections that folks want to share? Experiences, recommendations? Heidi or Carolyn, I don't know if you wanted to share.
There are organizations out there that are fully Indigenous owned and run that do the environmental sciences, right from ecology, biology, right to archaeology. And one of them that does that and will go across Canada is For Directions of Conservation Consulting Service. So there are ones that do have Indigenous biologists, ecologists, work in terrestrial. Sometimes looking them up, they work directly for First Nations and will advocate on behalf of those First Nations. Miigwech.
Great, thanks, Heidi. Yeah, lots of organizations that work with First Nations and how to connect that. That's really helpful. And like you mentioned, For Directions. Obviously, many people have worked with Firelight and others, but very helpful. Michelle, you want to come back in?
Yeah, just wanted to comment on, I think, something that we're seeing more recently, and that's fires. And what we're seeing here in our area, and I live in the Mid-Fraser, just south of the Big Bar Slide, and felt the impacts and grieved those impacts and that loss. But what we're seeing with the BC Wildfire Service, and I brought it up with the minister about 3 weeks ago, is that their back burns, which I told them do not refer to them as cultural or traditional burns, are having a big impact on the climate and our way of life. When ashes are falling, we've got to tell them those are the ashes of the wildlife. That's the deer and the bear, the cougars, the foxes, the coyotes. That's what's falling down on us. And you almost have to say it like that so you grab their attention. As hard it is to say that, and it's sad that that's how we have to accept that. And I think all of us collectively have to bring that message that back burns are not to happen in our community or on our territory, and that we insist that our elders are part of incident command to talk to them about the weather and how it's going to change, because we all know every meeting they open with, it's always the weather reports, the first thing, and it's like they apply it right across the province. Well, every mountain peak in my territory has a different weather pattern, right? So we need to educate them big time, right? And it's unfortunate because we always get the new people, the young people come in, and I just feel they're pyromaniacs, and they're contributing to climate change. And while doing that, they're literally burning up our way of life and the animals' way of life. They have their own set of laws. And so even their knowledge in the forest is being lost. And we need to make sure that it's kept, or we won't be able to do this for the future. So we need to be very strong in how we deal with these people that come into our nation. Thank you.
Yeah, Miigwech for that really powerful reflection. Travis, I see your hand up.
Yeah, Wade from the Kamloops to Secwepemc Nation. Yeah, the way that last speaker just ended there about people coming into the territory, we've got so many cumulative impacts into our climate that there's pieces that maybe even fall outside of our resource legislation that we're often tasked with. We break ours into water, land, air, and life. But we think about the population boost and the growth, and it's all tied to that economy. So, Canada put forward that 500, I can't remember, was it 500,000 immigration boost per year? And we see those emigrations from cities and other countries into our regions, and we see our territory shrink with the amount of private land and growth, regional municipalities. Agriculture is a big one. Agriculture, the amount of water, fresh water they use, the salmon's water, and even the tilling, the old process of tilling and the climate impacts. We've seen a big boom in mining. We have a lot of copper and gold mining here in our territory, so air emissions are quite just rubber stamped quite often. So there's not a lot of it's all archaic legislation that we deal with. So we bring forward the air as our relation and try to protect it as much as possible. But yeah, it's just that archaic legislation. So it's good to have AFN focus on some of these things, but there's just so many cumulative ones that we do take on and challenge, right from your smallest ones. Just keep records of engagement. The smallest one in the world you can take to the biggest Supreme Court case and win. So for all those that have those roles and those jobs protecting the land, yeah, keep those records. Shem, thanks.
Thank you, Rich, for that. That was really, really insightful. And yeah, it speaks to also just, we can't separate climate from the reality of the land and water and the decision making and powers associated with that. And so really important reminder of all of those interconnections. And yeah, I really just love the framing of water, air, land, and life and how to communicate that. And it makes me think, just earlier we referenced, how do we make sure that this language that is contained within the toolkit is accessible, and that feels like an obvious way to do that. Any other hands or reflections that folks want to share? Anything that really came to mind on the basis, want to create space for all of you? Yeah, Heather, feel free to jump back in.
Oh, thanks. I was just going to mention that I've been looking at how other nation states, particularly small island nation states, are responding to the climate emergency. And I think there's a lot of good learning that we in the global north could have around the way they're dealing with it. In the Caribbean, for example, they're at the forefront of early warning systems. And so just, maybe looking beyond and looking at what Indigenous peoples are doing in other jurisdictions. I know Australia has a lot of work in this area. And from conversations I've started to have around a project I'm working on, is that they're kind of 5 years ahead of us, at least, around these things in many ways. Obviously, that's a very generalistic kind of statement, but yeah, just looking to what's happening in other jurisdictions for promising practices could be really useful. Thanks.
That's great. Yeah, thanks for that, Heather. And even toolkits that other Indigenous peoples have prepared in other jurisdictions may be really helpful. Any other reflections or comments from folks? I appreciate. Thanks for you coming in, Heidi. Carolyn, anything that you wanted to share? You wrote me in the chat.
No, I just wanted to mention that vulnerability needs to be a factor in risk assessments. I know we're doing, different risk assessments for climate change, for infrastructure, the PIVC. They introduced the PIVC Green now. You might be interested in that. So that's more green infrastructure. So that could refer to traditional grounds, anything that's maintained. Yeah, and just natural assets. So not identifying the natural assets during your risk assessments is really, really important, I found. We've been going through this process for the last 3 years here at the Tribal Council with our 8 First Nations in central and northern west side of the province of Manitoba. And we found that at least going through the activity, I know we were just focusing on buildings, for instance, but when we added natural assets and then did our scoring for that, we found that they were all interconnected. So the natural world was connected to the built world.
Mm.
But yeah, that was really all I was getting at. And then also having the ability to inventory those natural assets and put a value to them. So IISD, that's a group that works a lot with the United Nations. I read a document where they put a value on natural assets and they can teach others how to do that. So I really found that interesting that someone out there started to do that. So
Awesome. Really, thanks for sharing that, Carolyn. Really, really helpful. Anyone else want to share any experiences, reflections before we maybe jump back into the presentation? Nick, any reflections you want to share?
Well, this has been really great. All the information sharing that's been going on will really help us guide the direction. My focus is on the inclusion of youth. So if anybody has any examples on how that's worked on their community or within an organization, like any tips you can pass on, we really want to ensure that the youth stay engaged from this past gathering, and develop like what a national youth council could look like and how we can get them incorporated in this education and information sharing. So I would say those are my priorities moving forward to the next gathering. And yeah, welcome folks to put it in the chat or even message us after this session is done.
That's great. Thanks, Nick. Yeah, maybe if there are no hands, I'll just go to just kind of what we're thinking in that path forward, and Nick kind of introduced that a little bit. And so we are preparing those 2 National Climate Gathering reports. We've prepared reports for our past 2 climate gatherings, and all of that is on our website. We have a series of videos. We should also mention, and I'll put in the chat, we have put the plenary day 1, 2, and 3 discussions from the National Climate Gathering up on the AFN YouTube. And so if folks weren't there or folks want to rewatch it, it is there. There's a lot of insight that was shared, and so trying to make that as accessible as we've described. Our intention is to continue the implementation of our national climate strategy. One focal point is the climate action toolkit, and I'll talk in a second about what we're thinking in that path forward. But as Nick shared, the standing up of that youth advisory committee, we also are going to work on some policy tools. So how to actually use the First Nations climate lens in a policy context, like what are the ways in which that we can apply that. We've developed different analysis on that basis, whether Canada's net zero emissions targets and their approach, the concept of mitigation or adaptation, the concept of clean electricity through that lens. And so trying to think of that as actually a policy tool and document. And then just to come back to the climate action toolkit, like holding those dedicated workshops. And so we'll continue to use this space, refine this, and provide more detail in the actual contents of that, and then workshop it with people. How do we make this usable? How does it resonate? How does it connect all that you folks have shared already? And how does it, really provide benefit for what's being done, and how best to do that. And then how do we also work with our leadership, the ACE committee, and doing that. The final mentee that I wanted to, well, I have two final mentees for you to just share with us. One relates to if you have any thoughts on how you want to be engaged moving forward. And then there'll be a second one on just, any other points that you wanted to raise with us in this space. So give a little bit of time and folks sharing how they want to be engaged, and can go from there. And again, if you want to comment and just verbally, feel free to throw your hand up. But yeah, want to make sure that we can continue to do this collaboratively. Yeah, online engagement, topic specific webinars, really good. Train the trainer, like a collective working session itself. Host more of these sessions and maybe dig into these, even the resources that, a couple of you shared, the experiences and how to map that and think about that. It's really helpful. Leave it for a minute or so. Yeah. Newsletter style updates. Awesome. Yeah. Online email updates got in the chat as well. And sorry, folks, we know that when I mention the chat, I don't think it goes to everybody, but it does go to the hosts. And so we can see it and can speak and share it with all of you. Yeah, how do we have those regular interval updates? And so we do have a website at AFN, but we can continue to improve and share on that. Yeah, how to support and use our different positionality on yeah, just in different academics or other work. Yeah, and great if you're in your region thinking about doing similar sessions, and there's a way that we can have that connectivity, that would be really great. For folks, Mel White is on our team as well, who is from Treaty 3, and so yeah, good kind of immediate connections with that, and no worries for those in the chat whose mentee closed, not an issue at all. Feel free to keep writing, and we can do that. Cool, yeah. On the land sessions at sites of mitigation, different winds. How do we focus these areas on pieces that are applied with special? Awesome. I'll just leave maybe another minute or so. And I neglected to say this, but I think there's a really important point about just, and Christopher, you raised it, just about the role of Indigenous guardians and land and water guardians. And we do work very closely with folks who advocate heavily on that. And so it's a really important recommendation for this work broadly of how to make sure that we connect that to things already happening. Okay, just on the basis of this, I just want to, yeah, kind of create a final opportunity for people. Just if you have anything to add. Oh, whoops. Oh, that, well, I guess that's the end of that. Sorry. But yeah, so all that to say, please feel free to continue to be engaged with us. If you have other reflections that you wanted to share with us, either put them in writing. We'll also, I realized that we hadn't put our contact details. So I'll just put my email in. Nick, I don't know if you can put yours. I'll put Mel's in. Yeah, feel free to reach out. You would have received the calendar invite from us. And yeah, really happy to kind of continue this discussion with all of you. And yeah, to make sure that we continue to develop this in a good way. Are there any final comments or reflections that folks want to share before we go to Lorraine, Knowledge Keeper Lorraine, to close us in a good way? I think we've got a lot of really insightful content from folks. So you'll have access to this PowerPoint. We'll also just share with all of you the like filled out Menti, so you can access that. You can just see what other people have provided. Heather, you had mentioned just a couple of links that you had in there, and happy to. Well, those are already included, so you'll be able to see those and access those for folks who are interested. And yeah, like really grateful for all of you taking the time to be with us. Nick, any closing comments that you want to share?
I'd be really interested to see where folks want us to host the next gathering. That's
Nice.
been top of my mind since we started planning. So, yeah, if folks want us to come back to the prairies, or maybe we could move out to the Ottawa area. Yeah, definitely. If you have some ideas, we would love to know, and just want to take the opportunity to thank folks for coming and for sharing a lot of the information and the work that's going on back home. Really appreciate it. And also thank you to Elder Lorraine for jumping in and getting us started in a good way and closing us out.
Awesome, Miigwech. If there are no hands up, let's go to you, Elder.
Masi Cho, and thank you so much. I've, all the comments that were made were just so helpful, and just feel so encouraged by all of your input and your vision for moving forward. Climate change affects every one of us in every corner of our country of Canada. With a climate gathering that was held last fall, you showcased the First Nations people from all across our country of all the good work that's being done. And for me, it was so great to hear from all of our young people, our young leaders from across Canada. You came together, you showed your leadership, you gave all of us hope. I saw the strength in every gathering, in every room. They were talking about our hope and our strength for moving forward. And you shared your wisdom with all of us that came from your grandmothers and grandfathers. And we'll hold on to that, and we'll stand in unity with each other to continue all of your good work, all of our good work. Our knowledge keepers always told us that we cannot talk about the water without talking about the land, without talking about the animals. We are all connected. Our spiritual connection to our sacred lands, waters, everything that lives on Mother Earth is the foundation of everything that we're doing. our land guardians from our past, our land guardians present. We'll just keep that in prayer and we'll keep moving forward, especially in these uncertain times. It's so very important. We have the tools that you provided, and we'll just keep each other strong from the teachings of our elders. Yen do di trin and go venget for all of our children in the future. So I say masi cho to each and every one of you. And I'll say prayer in my Gujin language, and we'll just give thanks to our Gagwadat for this meeting that we held. We'll give thanks for our families who always stand with us in the work that we do. We'll give thanks for our knowledge keepers and our leaders who guide us through and help us in our work. And we'll pray for each and every one of you that you have a good day. Kakwada je kakuti. Ju hakudedech uinli. Jukjachala kat queenzi niha. Tal jil en jet hai chono jinu. Kakwada go kutret kujet queenzi di en jet kutret qua en jet masi chogo vo jinu. Yen do di trin en di chet sal kat queenzi go gwen dai en jet juk nan chu jit di jinan kakwan dai tak en jet kutret kukwa en jet go ogone en di trin en di chet sal kat nitin digin chu go ogone en gagwadat juk Drin Queenzy Diakutoko Heda at Hai Cho no Jinu. Masi Cho, everyone. Thank you. Have a good day.
Jimmy Gwitch, Mother Lorraine for closing us in such a wonderful way, and really grateful for everybody who participated actively. Grateful for our tech teams, and grateful also for our interpreters and being here. And just a reminder that this is part of a series of webinars. And so if anybody is interested in participating in the rest of them, just refer to our AFN events website. So Chimigwech everyone, and have a really good day and a great long weekend.